Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 on Wednesday, the 8th of September. My name is Maggie Lennon and we'll start the programme with the most up-to-date statistics for the coronavirus. As of 2 o'clock today, a total of 2,891,907 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and UK Government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 2,411,083 have been confirmed negative and 480,824 have tested positive. There are 5,810 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all of those with symptoms will be tested. There were 17 newly reported deaths of people who've tested positive, and the number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 8,198. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 883 were in hospital last night, 82 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 o'clock this morning, 4,130,841 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination and 3,749,767 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show 133,674 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness. That's an increase of 191 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just hospitals. As at the 5th of September, 10,612 deaths have been registered in Scotland, where the coronavirus was mentioned on the death certificate, according to statistics published today by the National Records of Scotland. In the week 30th of August to the 5th of September, 58 deaths were registered that mentioned COVID-19 on the death certificate, an increase of 10 deaths from the previous week. I'm joined this evening by Professor John Robertson, who might be known to many of you as the author of the blog Talking Up Scotland. Good evening, John.
Good evening.
The producer here has been poring over the statistics for coronavirus and tells me that the 14-day average is an indication that we are on the turn and things are going to get better for coronavirus in Scotland. What's your feeling about that?
I've had the same kind of feeling. I hesitate to be too confident because this thing can catch us out. But I don't look at the 14-day average. I've been looking at the 7-day average, which is clearly not as impressive as the 14-day one. But I see a definite flattening over the last few days. I think the figures for the last 7 days have been lower than they were 8 days ago. So, and it does look like the kind of flattening that you get before a fall. Now, we've had that before. And it follows, of course, that sharp surge, which emerged in the days after schools returned, and in the days after thousands were at football matches, very large numbers. One of my neighbours catching it at Celtic Park. So yeah, I think we could be cautiously optimistic. I think that maybe we've seen the worst. Although we now face the return of university students in large numbers. So who knows.
And they were a spike last year, so we may wait and see. And we've got Transmit happening in Glasgow this weekend, so there'll be an awful lot of young people there. So I'm not quite sure we're quite out of the woods. Certainly the numbers in the hospitals are rising and they need to get down before we get into the really serious part of the winter. One of the main stories this week, of course, has been the programme for government for the Scottish Government. The debate continued today in Holyrood and it was all about the economy. Promoting sustainable growth, supporting businesses and tackling skills shortages will be central to Scotland's economic recovery, according to Economy Secretary Kate Forbes. The 2021-22 programme for government outlines how the Scottish Government will drive the green industrial revolution and help people into fair work by investing $500 million over this Parliament to create high-quality jobs and improve skills. This year, this includes up to $70 million for the Young Persons Guarantee, up to $20 million for the National Transition Training Fund, supporting sectors hardest hit by the pandemic, and up to $20 million to help long-term unemployed access and sustain fair work. To maximise Scotland's economic potential, $100 million will be invested in research and development targeting companies developing the innovative technologies of the future. A new £20 million rural entrepreneur fund will help ensure growth is spread across the country, while the Small Business Bonus Scheme, Fresh Start Relief and Business Growth Accelerator are all to continue for the lifetime of the Parliament. Key economic commitments include a community wealth building bill to help create and protect jobs and enable greater community and third sector ownership of assets, create a new national infrastructure company and invest $33 billion in infrastructure, bolstering supply chains, invest $1 billion during this Parliament, including $200 million this financial year, in the Scottish National Investment Bank to build its portfolio, a $500 million Just Transition Fund to support the North East and Moray over the next decade, a new $50 million National Challenge competition to be launched in late autumn will support projects with the greatest potential to transform Scotland's economy, provide $100 million to improve the digital capabilities of business, invest up to $20 million this year furthering our No One Left Behind ambitions and providing support to those facing long-term unemployment, and identify initial projects for the Green Growth Accelerator this year, marking an important first step to unlocking up to £200 million of public sector investment in incentivising local authorities to deliver low-carbon infrastructure. And finally, make the first payments from the government's £100 million Green Jobs Fund. That's quite a shopping list, John. Is there anything on there that particularly takes your fancy?
I find it really quite impressive. When I first saw the agreement and then saw this programme, I thought at first, is this just me? Because I'm an optimist by nature, so I sometimes tend to think things are better than they are. But I had a quick look around, and Caroline Lucas, the former leader of the Green Party in England, who's somebody I've been impressed with over the years, she said of this programme, I was quite impressed by this. She said it represents the most radical change any government in the UK has proposed since the 1945 Labour Manifesto. And the left-wing online magazine Left Foot Forward, which is more Corbyn than Starmer, they said it put the Westminster government to shame. And so that makes me think that, well, it wasn't. I'm not reacting over optimistically when I see it. It's a kind of focus. It's a government that's focusing on things that can be done, on things that need to be done, and using research evidence to back it up, making intelligent choices, and at the same time compassionate for the people they govern. And I know I'm giving them a hell of a talk up here, but I think it's tremendously impressive. And I'm not an economics expert, so I wouldn't want to try and pick out any of the individual developments. I've been, I have to say, more impressed by some of the environmental elements within it, and which are economic as well, I agree, and also by the plans to protect, for example, the people who need affordable housing, to protect tenants. There's a huge amount in there I think is really very worthy.
Well, yes. I mean, today's debate was all about the economy, but I think yesterday the targets for building new houses was unveiled, and that was pretty impressive, actually. And actually, the Scottish Government does have a record on house building, which is clearly needed. One of the things you mentioned is it's based on research, and that's been an absolute, I think that's fair to say that the Scottish Government, for the last 10 years at least, have always promoted evidence-based policy. Sometimes I'm often a bit sceptical about where they get their evidence from. I'm not always sure that public consultations are the best place, but this does seem to be driving this. Do you think, how much do you think some of the green elements in this programme for government are as a result of the new deal with the Greens, which, although it's just been announced, has obviously been in development for several months, probably since the May election. So how much influence do you see that they've had in this programme for government?
Uh-huh. Well, I mean, I'm not an insider there, so I wasn't party to the kind of debates that took place in that process. It would seem unlikely that the Greens weren't quite influential in all of this, and I mean, they have an engineer in their top team there who knows a huge amount about this. My impression over a longer period has been that this Scottish Government, before Nicola Sturgeon and since, has a very different attitude towards academics. Now, I speak as a retired academic, so I'm kind of biased here. But my impression has been that certainly the Conservative Party is contemptuous of most academics, unless those academics will reinforce their existing prejudices and bias. I have the impression you can see it, for example, with the way they've taken the advice of Professors Bald and Sridhar on the management of the pandemic, that they're listening. They're listening in a way which I don't think many politicians have done in the past quite so much. Maybe Harold Wilson back in the 60s with his white light of British technology was listening to scientists and engineers. But I think as a rule, a lot of politicians are a bit contemptuous. And they say the public's fed up with experts. I don't think the public is. I think if the public heard more of experts, they might actually feel more secure.
Well, it's a trait, isn't it, of the right wing, though, to be anti-intellect
Yeah.
and anti-science. And we've seen that, obviously, what was happening with Trump in the States, and to some extent what's happened with people in Britain who have been trying to stir up the right wing in terms of the scientific input into the COVID situation. But do you think actually, I mean, obviously leaving aside the anti-vaxxers and the kind of lunatic fringe, do you think that people are, because of COVID, actually more likely now to listen to experts and listen to people who really know their stuff, rather than these keyboard warriors who, claim to have done their research, which really is just read things off social media that already kind of feed into their own prejudices?
Yeah, well, I think we have very clear evidence in numerous opinion polls. I mean, really numerous. We're talking hundreds of opinion polls since the pandemic started, which I think uniformly say that people like the stricter approach to pandemic control, which they associate with the Scottish Government. They dislike the chopping and changing and the apparent weakness in the face of pressure from small and large businesses. There seems to be, I don't think there's any doubt that around 70% of the UK population likes the kind of approach that the Scottish Government's adopted, advised by people like Bald and Sridhar. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But to watch Reporting Scotland, of course, and when they bring on the manager of a strip club owner to contradict the epidemiologists, you wonder really about all of that.
Well, I was going to say, I was going to come to exactly that. You wouldn't, if you looked at mainstream media in Scotland, have any sense that this approach to government is so different from what's happening in the rest of the country. So those quotes that you read out at the beginning from Caroline Lucas and from that publication are extremely encouraging. And I think that if you like, that's almost the theme of tonight's programme. We will be looking at things that are coming up through Westminster and just seeing that increasingly, in terms of approach to social justice, approach to that word compassion that you used, there is increasingly clear blue water between the two governments. So let's just turn then to the issue that, of course, is exercising a huge number of people just now about the attitude of people on low incomes from the current UK government, and that's the suggestion, or not in fact the suggestion, the plans to impose a national insurance tax rise to pay for health and social care in England. There have been calls for Douglas Ross and the Scottish Tory MPs to oppose Boris Johnson's regressive tax hike, which will leave millions of Scottish families, young people and the low-paid worse off, and which risks Scotland being sold short in terms of money received in return. Speaking about the UK government's plans to break yet another Tory manifesto commitment by increasing national insurance by 1.25%, the SNP Shadow Chancellor Alison Thewlis MP said, "The Westminster Tory government tax hike, breaking yet another manifesto commitment, is regressive and will unfairly punish millions of Scottish families, young people and the low-paid." The New Economics Foundation has calculated that 2.5 million people, working households, will be affected by both the £20 a week cut to universal credit and this increase in national insurance. On average, they will lose out by £1,290 in the next financial year. SNP MPs will oppose this toxic tax rise, and it's vital that all Scottish MPs across Parliament today stand up for Scottish families and communities to reject this Tory poll tax, which risks Scotland being sold short and receiving less in return than the money taken from Scottish-based national insurance payers. Time and time again, Douglas Ross and his Scottish Tory colleagues have ignored the warnings and shamefully fallen in line behind Boris Johnson to do his bidding. They must at long last find a backbone and vote against these tax plans. Well, first of all, John, do you think there's any possibility that they will find a backbone? In fact, do they have a backbone, and will they vote against these tax increases, or will they just fall into line? What would be your guess?
Well, it's quite an easy guess, isn't it, given history, that the Scottish Conservatives have towed the line all the way down that particular line. They are never pressurised by BBC Scotland. They're never doorstepped and asked to account for the fact that their leader in Westminster is acting in a way that just about everyone in Scotland, including a fair percentage, I'm sure, of Conservative voters, find unacceptable. This is. I mean, I'm not shocked. It's a sad thing to say that I'm not shocked by this. That this particular Conservative regime sees the taxation of the whole population, including those on very low wages, as the way to deal with this problem. When there are significant elements of the country who are paying hardly any tax at all, when there are corporations paying next to no tax, when there are people sending their money offshore, and it's largely to protect let's say the upper middle and upper earners who wish to be able to hang on to their inheritances and pass it from generation to generation, and so to therefore reinvent and keep going that huge class divide that this country still has, one of the most unequal countries in Europe.
I looked hard to see if I could find any mainstream media kind of reflect that request or requirement that the Scottish Tories defended the people of Scotland. I didn't see it reported anywhere. What I have seen reported widely, though, is focusing on the fact that despite this tax rise, money will come to Scotland. 1.1 billion supposedly will come to Scotland, which will have to be spent on health and social care. Now, that's a difficult issue, is it not, for the Scottish Government to deal with? It's a difficult message to play. They can't be seen to be turning their back on that and saying we don't want that money, because obviously, despite the fact our way of dealing with health and social care issues is very different, and we're looking at developing a national care service, that's money that would be incredibly useful. So what's the message that needs to come across? So that, the current message that this isn't the way to do it, that there could have been a better way to have got the money, is fine, but that isn't going to happen. They're not going to tax the rich. They're not going to tax companies. They're not going to cancel major projects like, HS2 or any of that. It's going to be national insurance, and we have to suck it up. So what's the clever message that the SNP and other people who are opposing this need to come out with, so that they're not seen to be kind of alienating people by saying, well, we don't want that money?
Well, I think you've summed it up really there. It's an impossible situation for the Scottish Government. They can't really win. I mean, as you said, they cannot under any circumstances refuse the money with the potential it has to seriously improve, in particular, care of the elderly. That will happen. The act or the bill will pass unamended because of the majority of what is around 80 MPs that they have. So it will go through as it is. Scottish taxpayers will pay increased national insurance, including those on very low incomes, will pay towards that. And then the media will, as it has done already, imply that it's some kind of a gift from Westminster to Scotland, despite, but that's something we've had for decades, haven't we? This idea that Scotland is given things. And it reinforces this dependency myth. There are a very significant proportion of people in England believe that Scotland is in some kind of dependency towards England. I don't think you asked about the message there, and it was my area of expertise. I regret to say there isn't any way out of this. I think we just have to accept it and move on and find other arguments. And there are many other arguments, of course, to push for independence. But I don't think we'll get much out of this one.
But it will be absolutely brought up again and again and again and again about the strength of the union, undoubtedly. So maybe the message is to just keep shouting loudly, bought and sold for English gold, because it wouldn't have been the first time. The pressure on this issue, however, isn't going to go away, and it's not going away today, because Ian Blackford's been piling on the pressure too. He said that Boris Johnson is balancing the books on the backs of the poor and the young. Speaking at Prime Minister's questions, Ian Blackford MP said that the increase was a Tory poll tax that is being imposed on millions of Scottish families against Scotland's will, and would penalise low and middle income workers and the young to subsidise the wealthy. The SNP Westminster leader said the combination of Tory tax cuts, hikes, and amounted to austerity volume 2. The Scottish families being hit by a triple whammy of universal credit cuts, premature termination of furlough, and this increase in taxes. He said independence is the only way to keep Scotland safe and secure, a strong and fair and an equal recovery. Well, he would say that, wouldn't he? That is his job. But actually, he isn't the only voice in the wilderness about this. And despite the fact that it's unlikely Douglas Ross is going to, find a backbone, there have been quite a few Tory grandees coming out and making their voices heard. A former Tory Work and Pension Secretary has said the whole thing is a sham. A former Tory Chancellor has said that it was the poor subsidising the rich, and a former Tory Prime Minister has said that it was a regressive taxation. It seems to be that we've now got a morally bankrupt government overseeing the economic bankruptcy of the country, or is that being too strong?
No, I think all of that is true, but I think the sad fact is that the mainstream media will not communicate it quite as sharply as you have just done, and therefore it probably won't have much impact. I think it will stagger on from one thing to the next, and this government, the opinion polls still put the Conservative Party fairly safely ahead. Boris has lost a little in the opinion polls, but if there was an election tomorrow, the Tories would win again. Around 40% of the population in England are either people who think that these policies are good for them, and maybe they are good for them because of their income and their estates, or they're people who've been persuaded, and through their lack of intelligence, they've come to believe that's the case. But the Conservative Party has been strong in the south and east of England for centuries almost, maybe 2 centuries. And there's little sign that's going to change. And as long as they have around 40% under this electoral system, they keep control. Luckily, we have the same kind of people in Scotland, but they're 1 in 5 rather than 4 in 5. Don't know how that worked out, but isn't it lucky? And as you said already, the only way out is out of this situation. And it might be that, for the people of England, it may actually be beneficial were we to get out and were they to then further slide down this hole of despair, then maybe at some point, what's kind of a silent majority just now in England will at some point decide enough's enough, and we might see Jeremy Corbyn back.
Well, I mean, the red wall is the kind of key to that. So yes, obviously they have been strong in the southeast, and we keep saying, but there's the red wall. The Tories have got the red wall. Surely these kind of policies that are coming forward, the cuts in universal credit, the furlough ending, this tax hike, all the other things that they're bringing in is going to affect people in these constituencies who might decide that they've been duped. So on the issue of being duped, I'm wondering why there is no media outlet that I can see speaking to that constituency of people who voted for Brexit because they maybe did believe the 350 million lie on the side of the bus, and they kind of held their nose and said, well, okay, it's going to look like we've got into bed with the racists and the fascists, but if it is going to mean that the health service gets more money, it has to be a good thing. These people must be extremely confused at the moment, and nobody seems to be challenging the government on that and saying, well, if now we know it was a lie, but nobody in the media is nailing them to that particular cross at the moment and saying, well, if that was going to happen, we wouldn't have needed this tax hike. So I do feel sorry. I mean, I feel a certain amount of sympathy for people who are a bit stupid, but I do feel sorry for people who really thought that was something that was going to happen. And there were people in Scotland thought that as well, to be fair. It wasn't all people in England.
There were some, yeah, it's true.
Well. Well, you talked about going down a hole. Yes, you talked about Britain going down a hole of despair, and the news really doesn't get any better. The UK is now on course to lose its status as one of Germany's top 10 trading partners this year for the first time since 1950, as Brexit-related trade barriers drive firms in Europe's largest economy to look for business elsewhere. In the first 6 months of this year, German imports from the UK sank nearly 11% year on year to €16.1 billion, while German exports to the UK rose by 2.5% to €32.1 billion. That could not prevent a decline in bilateral trade to about €48.2 million, pushing the UK down to 11th spot from 9th and from the position of 5th where they were before we voted to leave the EU in 2016. A December 2020 survey of Germany's BGA Trade Association showed 1 in 5 companies were reorganising supply chains to swap out UK-based suppliers for others in the EU. So where Germany leads, we have to assume that other European countries will follow. Now, when Brexit was being negotiated and people were warning of exactly this scenario, the British government were telling us that, oh no, it would be absolutely fine. There'd be no trade war. Red tape wouldn't get in the way. Tariffs wouldn't get in the way because it was just as much in Germany's interest as it was in Britain's to keep trading. Clearly, now that's been proven not the point, although, as we pointed out in that short extract, there are lots of exports coming in, almost twice as many exports coming in to Britain from Germany as is going out. And there's always been that sort of trade imbalance, mostly due to the car industry, I think. So here we're seeing it writ large. Do you think there'll be a domino effect? Do you think we'll see this, if we look at these figures in a year's time, that we'll see the same with other European countries, that we're no longer a key trading partner?
I can't see how it could be otherwise. We have chosen to leave the most successful economic bloc in history, and think that somehow we can still have a strong relationship with all of its parts. It's fairly clear, to me, it's fairly clear that one of the things that's happening right now with regard to the German population and other parts of Europe is that the people in this country, many of whom voted for Brexit and who are on maybe upper middle to upper incomes, still want BMWs and other expensive German cars. But people in Germany who were previously buying maybe a slightly lower standard produce don't care much about it. They'll buy something else. So I think Britain has shot itself in the foot very badly. We had David Duguid on the television at lunchtime today, bragging about the fact that Scotland was going to sell more whiskey to Australia, and and there have been other cases of of trade deals being done. I think we're trying to get involved in a trade deal on the Pacific Fringe, and so we'd have to put all of our stuff in boats and send it all halfway around the world to sell it. I mean, it's just it's just crazy dreams. We're in a bad situation, and economically it gets worse. And again, the only way out for Scotland is out, and then to start again and reforge our connections, which we had before the Union in 1707. We had strong connections with the Baltic and with Northern Europe, and we can forge those again.
Well, I was thinking before the programme started just what we did actually sell to Germany, and I haven't had time to kind of look into the details of the trade. But one of the things that wasn't in that short report, but if you dig into the figures, you discover actually the biggest impact is on agricultural produce. That has fallen by 80%, 80%. Now, that I suspect is where Scotland's impact is. I mean, I think a lot of the quality, because you were talking about inferior produce, but I think a lot of the quality produce that is bought in by Germany and other countries is a lot to do with Scotland's agricultural output, so fish and shellfish, beef and lamb and all the rest of it. Absolutely. So actually, we're not seeing specific figures on the impact on the Scottish economy, but I suspect it's those elements of the Scottish economy, including the drinks industry, that is really suffering. So the impact on Scotland is disproportionate.
Yeah, you're making an important point there about the food and drink industry. I haven't got the most recent figures, but I have seen figures in the last few years that are quite clear on this. Scotland has about 8% of the UK's population, but we have about 25% of food and drink exports. I mean, it's just an astonishing level of dependence that we have on food and drink exports, and if we put ourselves in a disadvantageous position with regard to the European bloc, and we find we can't sell those things, then I think we lose businesses, and we lose employment, and we lose tax.
There was a lot of fuss made at the time, and people who in the agricultural industry were concerned about Brexit when they were being saying, yes, but if you look at the figures, our biggest export of agricultural produce is to England. But what they weren't saying is it was raw produce that was going into processing for products that were then being sold on to Europe. So when those markets close, then there's no way that we need to be selling raw materials to England for processing. So I think you're right, and I'm sure somebody in the Scottish government has those figures. It would be interesting if we could get a hold of them. At the beginning of the programme, we were talking about the programme for government, and we were admitting and stressing there's a lot of green stuff in that. But it would appear that despite that, the Westminster government are still trying to tie our hands. The SNP government has said that the UK government is holding Scotland back from reaching its full potential in the global fight to tackle climate change as it continues to stall on its commitment to invest in carbon capture. Today at Scotland Questions, Aberdeen South MP Stephen Flynn urged the Scottish Secretary to confirm that the Acorn project in the northeast of Scotland would be one of the 2 carbon capture clusters in Scotland, the others in Grangemouth, to receive UK government funding next month. The call comes after successive UK governments have left Scotland without oil funds and seen Scotland's renewable projects pay the highest grid charges in the whole of Europe. However, Alistair Jack failed to give that commitment. Next month, the UK government is set to make a decision on which industrial carbon capture usage and storage clusters, so-called CCUSs, will receive funding prior to the crucial COP26 conference in Glasgow in November. The Scottish Cluster's economic assessment confirms that deploying CCS, hydrogen and direct air capture technologies in Scotland would support an average of 15,100 jobs between 2022 and 2050. If given funding next month, the cluster could start supporting these jobs as early as next year, and total jobs will peak at 20,600 in 2031. So this is clearly crucial to that whole just transition, that it's absolutely essential the Scottish economy and the Scottish government get their head around. But I wouldn't hold my breath for the UK government to make that commitment, because they've got form on this. In 2015, the then Tory government axed a 1 billion grant for a CCUS scheme in Peterhead that they'd committed to, and then they axed it, and that lost 600 jobs. So it kind of doesn't really matter what shade of Tory government or who's in charge. Clearly, they're failing government, and they're failing Scotland, and they're anti-Scotland. So what do you make of the impact on? I mean, this feels in a way that if they don't give us this money, if they don't stick to these commitments, they are deliberately undercutting a key principle of the Scottish economy. And if they do that, that's deliberately being done to reduce the Scottish government's impact on improving the economy and having a proper COVID recovery, as well as long-term economic development.
Yeah. I mean, it's clearly important for the unionist case that Scotland doesn't pull away in certain ways in terms of performance. I mean, clearly Scotland did, ironically, given that the oil industry is now something that requires to be trimmed quite seriously. It's ironic that we are now about to become far more successful than the rest of the UK in the use of renewables. I mean, Scotland, I think, is the 3rd highest in the world in terms of the percentage of energy generated by renewables. And of course, we're not an independent country. The others are. We're well ahead of Sweden and most other European countries. I think I'd be right in saying it's Norway and Iceland are the 2 leaders of that. You may remember them when I've forgotten her name now. The young Swedish environmentalist was saying that Scotland wasn't.
Greta Thunberg.
Yeah, that's Greta Thunberg. Yes. You remember that the BBC managed to twist her comments round to imply that she was saying Scotland wasn't a leading nation, and despite the fact that we are actually 3rd in a table of 50 or so, we're 3rd top in terms of use of renewables for energy. That was quite, and we don't have the advantages of being a fully independent country. So I don't think it's in the UK government's interest to see us be too successful, and it's not in their interest to be too transparent about the fact that we are subsidising the UK's green achievements that they have. I mean, there have been days, of course, when the UK as a whole seems to have improved in terms of its use of coal, and it seems to have improved in terms of its tree planting. But when you dig down, you discover that something like about 90% of all the new trees planted in the UK were planted in Scotland, and you find that huge amounts of electricity are being transferred across the border on a daily basis, and as you pointed out, at a disadvantageous rate to be allowed to sell it.
Obviously, Nicola Sturgeon made it clear that with the hopes for a referendum in 2023, she was going to get her civil servants to work on if you like, I guess a kind of green paper approach, again, very much similar to what we produced in 2014, where the case for independence was laid out and a very detailed understanding of how that would look, which when you compare it to the back of the fag packet, consideration that was given to Brexit is pretty astonishing. And that's important, obviously, but really what I feel is increasingly important as we head towards preparing for this constitutional debate is that people are really made aware of the number of times and the number of things that the UK government have done or will do to deliberately undermine the Scottish Government's plan for the country. And this would be a classic example of that, because I don't think people understand. And it's back to what we were saying earlier about the 1.1 billion money that's been dangled in front of us by the NI tax increase. If we make too much of a fuss, we'll be accused of not wanting that money. And I think it's somewhere, and I'm not sure that government is the right place to do that. I mean, it might be people like you, John, with your blog and bringing that information out, but people need to know these things, I think. And I think people would be surprised. I think that's the way to get people who are unsure about the constitutional debate to really think. Do you think that's something that we might see happening over the next 18 months or so?
Well, I suppose, I mean, for the last 7 years or so, we've had a lot of social media activity aimed at exposing the hypocrisy of the UK government, and sometimes the UK government's deliberate spoiling of what Scotland can do, that you've pointed out there. And I think we need to persist with that. But there is, and you may have touched on this, there is a slight problem with that if it's the only strategy, because it can seem to some people a bit whingy and repetitive. And I think some people switch off. I mean, you'll know this. Everyone knows this. If somebody has a strongly held belief, it's very, very difficult to change that. Extremely difficult. And one way not to change it is head on, not to try and undermine them in any way. I remember back in I mentioned earlier that I used to be a teacher. That one way of changing opinions is to say to people, yes, what you think. I think there's evidence maybe a few years back that might have been quite a reasonable explanation. That it's understandable that you thought that, and you may have been right. But do you think some things have changed since then? And not force things down their throat, but ask them to look at things and express their opinions. And I don't know how we do that in the media. It's more difficult because media tends to push things at people. And so you maybe touched on something earlier there. We need to have some kind of wider public debate outside of just mainstream politics, commissions and Ireland had what was the one in Ireland called on abortion? They had a national debate on that, and they had non-politicians leading it. That reminds me a little of ancient Greece. There was a time in ancient Greece when people who wanted to be politicians were not allowed to be politicians because they weren't trusted. And so it was in Athens at a particular point. So the rule was that everyone had to have a go. And no one wanted to be a politician. Well, nobody with any kind of brains wanted to be a politician. But you had to do it for a year. And then after a year, somebody else would have to do it. And anybody who wanted to be a politician, who liked power, was told basically get lost. You're not doing it. And I wonder if we maybe could move towards some kind of democratic society in Scotland of that nature.
Absolutely, a real citizens' parliament. Yeah, that's been spoken about by other people. But I think you're onto something there, John, because obviously social media isn't the place to get these messages out either, because they are just echo chambers. Twitter is toxic at the best of times. But I think you're right. Maybe that's the message for yes campaigning organisations to say that it is a national conversation that we have to have in village halls, in church halls, in cafes, wherever. And I know that certainly I'm a member of the National Committee of Women for Independence, and that's very much our approach to women, basing on the fact that what women have in common is more important than what divides us in some ways, and making that case. So, I think that's the way forward. And certainly the British government is giving us lots of ammunition. There's no doubt about that. So keep going, Boris. You're playing into our hands. Priti Patel is to hold meetings with the French Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin after a tense exchange between the two countries over the number of migrants crossing the Channel to the UK. The talks today follow an influx of small boats during the warm weather this week, increasing pressure on the Home Secretary from Downing Street and other members of her party. Patel started a war of words on Monday when she told MPs that Britain could withhold £54 million it had promised to pay France to help deal with the situation, unless more boats were intercepted. Conservative MPs have called for the Home Secretary to break international law and send all the migrants arriving illegally by boat straight back to France. A detailed rebuttal from the French Interior Ministry on Tuesday warned the UK not to attempt any action that was contrary to international law, saying there would be consequences if Britain refused to hand over cash that was agreed in July to combat small boat crossings. Commenting on the Home Secretary's meeting with her French counterpart, SNP Home Affairs spokesman Stuart MacDonald MP said Priti Patel must rethink her cruel and frankly unsuccessful approach to migrant channel crossings ahead of her meeting today with the French government. The UK government must carry out a root and branch reform of the whole asylum system to make it humane and fit for purpose. That means halting the cruel Nationality and Borders Bill, which would criminalise some of the most vulnerable in the world seeking protection in the UK. Failing to provide safe routes for refugees and their family simply force more into making dangerous journeys. Once again, it's being reported in the press, this use of illegal. It's not illegal to claim asylum. You're absolutely entitled to, and no one knows until people have arrived and made their claim why they're arriving and whether they have a genuine claim. And I think I'd say to Stuart MacDonald, Priti Patel has had a root and branch review of the asylum system, and that's resulted in the Nationality and Borders Bill, which is trying to say that in future, what she's trying to do is to make it impossible for people just to turn up and claim asylum, whether they arrive by boat, under a lorry, or on a plane. And instead, she wants to replace it with a completely resettlement approach to asylum and refugees. And they're pushing at that very, very heavily. And so that's the reality of the situation. Priti Patel is certainly not going to make any changes to her approach to migrants, I wouldn't have thought. Would you think that's a fair assessment, John?
I doubt very much that she plans to make any changes. It's a remarkable thing. Clearly, in the shorter term, we need to have a much more humane reaction to all of this. No doubt about that. We also, in the longer term, need to stop interfering in other countries and creating this kind of blowback. When powerful countries project their power into other countries because they want to change them in some way, they create blowback. Populations move. And when populations move, it's very difficult to stop them moving, unless you're going to be incredibly brutal about it. And hopefully, we're not going to go that far in the UK. But it's just astonishing that again we come out of Europe and we think we can still have the same deals operating.
Well, it's true. I mean, it's this idea that somehow by a war of words with the French is going to achieve anything. It wouldn't have achieved anything when we were all in the European club. It's certainly not going to achieve anything now. French are, just as good at digging in their heels as the British. I saw a meme today on social media that I thought summed it up beautifully, and it was a message to government. If you export weapons, be prepared to import refugees. And that is the absolute truth. As I say, what she's wanting to do is to import refugees on Britain's terms, hand-pick the people she wants to come into the country. And unfortunately, despite the fact there is some opposition to the Nationality and Borders Bill, I don't see it going. I see it going through, unless the one hope is that actually the House of Lords might take a stance on it, and it might therefore have to come back, and there might be some concessions, but I'm not sure. So I suspect Stuart MacDonald is passionate about this, but I don't imagine his claims today will only land on deaf ears. Afghan women, including the country's women's cricket team, will be banned from playing sport under the new Taliban government, according to an official in the headline at the hardline Islamist group. In an interview with Australian broadcaster SBS, the deputy head of the Taliban's Cultural Commission, Ahmadullah Wasiq, said women's sport was considered neither appropriate nor necessary. I don't think women will be allowed to play cricket because it is not necessary that women should play cricket, Wasiq said. In cricket, they might face a situation where their face and body will not be covered. Islam does not allow women to be seen like this. A new Taliban interim government drawn exclusively from loyalist ranks formally began work today, with established hardliners in all the key posts and no women, despite previous promises to form an inclusive administration. The US State Department expressed concern that the new cabinet included only Taliban, no women, and personalities with troubling track records. but said the new administration would be judged by its actions. The EU also condemned the new government for its lack of inclusion, saying it failed to honour vows from the new rulers to include different groups. The issue of women's rights is likely to dominate how the regime is judged by the international community, with the stance on women's sport and the all-male government being ominous warning signs. Sportswomen, including cricketers, have been in hiding in Afghanistan since the Taliban swept to power, with some women reporting threats of violence from Taliban fighters if they're caught playing. The ban on playing sport comes amid mounting evidence that the Taliban's attitude towards women has barely moderated since they were last in power, despite claims to the contrary. Well, we saw last week, before this story broke, that there's been numerous demonstrations of women across the country, mostly demanding the right to work, and they have been shut down forcibly and with some violence. So I don't really, this is not a surprise, but I absolutely, I can't begin to express my absolute frustration and anger with this idea that women's sport was considered neither appropriate nor necessary. That a government of any description can so dismiss 50% of its population is mind-boggling. However, I'm not at all convinced that the international community, they may say that women's rights are at the centre of their concern, but you look around some of these countries that are making the loudest noise, and their own attitude to women is pretty shocking as well. I'm thinking specifically about the issue in the United States with the challenges to abortion rights and women's rights there. So I think they'll make a lot of noise, but I don't see them doing anything about it. Do you?
No, you're quite right. Much of that is just keeping face in terms of, they've had a very embarrassing experience, the Americans and the UK, in terms of what's happening. 20 years of money and of lives down the drain to achieve very little. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I've got a slight suspicion the Taliban are not quite as bad. They're bad, but they're not quite as bad as they were 20 years ago. Some of the old guys are dead. And I think the younger leaders, some of them have been educated in the West. So I think the banning of sport for women is, while unacceptable to us, maybe something that's not the worst that could happen there.
No, but what underpins that is this idea that women can't be shown. The reality is the burqa is back. And the minute that women are forced into burqas, I'm sorry, that's unacceptable, and they're just as bad. Some of the people who are in government, I was looking today at some of them, they are the real hardliners. Quite a few are on like the FBI's most wanted list. There are people who are international terrorists. Some of them in particular are head up kind of groups that are in alliance to the Taliban that are recognised as international terrorist groups. You have a government made up of international criminals. I don't know how you can say they're not as bad as the past, and I think they've tried to appear as a bit more reasonable. I mean, they've had English-speaking media commentators. I think it's just all bluff. Actually,
spin.
I think it's all spin.
Obviously, I'm in no position. There is one person I read quite a lot, Professor Paul Martin. I think is it Paul Martin? His name is Paul Rogers at Bradford University, who's been writing on the war on terror for more than 20 years now. And he seems to have some inside information that suggests that while there will be regional variations, and in some of the smaller towns and country areas, they are back to the Middle Ages in terms of the treatment of women. He seemed to think that in Kabul it might not be quite so bad. But again, we're probably grasping at straws here. And I think, but what do we do about it? I mean, we've seen what happens if we try to intervene to save women and girls. We're not going to do that again, are we? I don't think. So we can only hope that over time these situations will gradually improve. I mean, Scotland in 1500. I know it's 500 years ago. Scotland in 1500, not much different from that.
No, absolutely not. The fact that women are in hiding, though, I think women's instincts are pretty strong. Women are going into hiding. They know what's coming. The trial of 20 men accused of involvement in the 2015 wave of terrorist attacks in Paris that killed 130 and left hundreds more injured has opened in the French capital's historic law courts. At 13:17 today, Judge Jean-Louis Perry said the criminal hearing is open, launching a marathon legal process that is scheduled to last 9 months. 14 suspects were in the dock, including Salah Absalam, who is accused of being the only surviving member of the Islamist commando unit that carried out the shootings and suicide bombings in the city on the 13th of November 2015. 6 others are being tried in their absence, 5 of them presumed dead in Iraq or Syria, and the last in prison in Turkey. Absalom, wearing a black mask and black t-shirt, was the first of the accused to be addressed. Asked his name, he took off his mask to reveal a thick beard. Firstly, I will say there is no God except Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. Asked his profession, he replied, I have given up all profession to become a soldier with the Islamic State. He refused to give his parents' names, insisting, the name of my father and of my mother has nothing to do with this, and said he had no address. He gave his date of birth as the 15th of September, 1989. 11 of the accused were driven to the Palais de Justice from 4 different prisons for the trial that will hear from 300 lawyers and around 300 of the 1,750 civil parties, including survivors, victims' relatives, and those directly affected by the attack. Perret said is the chief judge and will preside over the court with 8 other professional magistrates. The courtroom, a temporary structure built within the law courts, is the scene of the biggest criminal trial ever in France. Islamic State claimed responsibility for the series of coordinated attacks, including a suicide bomb at the Stade de France and a massacre at the Bataclan concert hall, as well as drive-by shootings and suicide bombings at cafes and restaurants. Around 1,000 police and gendarmes were reportedly deployed to maintain security and seal off the area around the Palais de Justice on an island in the Seine, diverting vehicles, pedestrians and buses. Obviously, the French are concerned about reprisal attacks, and you can't blame them. I'm not sure why this has taken so long to come to court. I'm not sure if you're aware of any reasons for that, John, or is that just the slow pace of justice?
I think it's something that lawyers have learned to develop as a way of maximising their income, to be quite honest. That's why things are slow in the legal profession. How else do they make huge amounts of money that way? The situation in Paris, I don't suppose any different. I don't know if the French legal system is slower than the UK one or not, but it's largely to do with money, I think.
I mean, I'm expecting, as they've already claimed responsibility and as they'll be seen as some kind of martyr, I don't imagine there's any doubt of what the verdict will be, or indeed what the outcome will be of that. So it's maybe more of a show trial for both. But I think the danger of that could be, although it is clearly for the survivors and the families, victims, a chance to have some justice, there's always a concern that it becomes a showcase for what they did and might actually help radicalise more people. So it's always a tricky balance, I think.
Yeah, I mean, terror attacks by Islamic groups in the West, in Western Europe and in North America, are far lower than they were a few years back. I mean, unfortunately, the terror takes place in the Middle East and in Afghanistan on a daily basis. I think there's some evidence, I think, from the US as well, is that right-wing white supremacist terror is a far greater risk to the American state than Islamic groups are.
France, obviously, though, has had a sort of disproportionate, perhaps, number of terror attacks. I'm not quite sure why that is. I mean, there may be historical reasons, but I think it might be something to do with the French state being so determined to have a complete separation between state and all religions. They're sometimes seen as an enemy of Islam. Back home in Scotland, fewer children and young people should end up in care thanks to a $500 million fund to help support families to stay together. Announced as part of the latest programme for government, the Whole Family Wellbeing Fund will help families to overcome challenges before they reach crisis point. The fund aims to significantly reduce the number of children and young people in care by 2030 and will provide support on a range of issues, including child and adolescent mental health, child poverty, alcohol and drugs misuse, and educational attainment. In 2020, the Scottish Government made a commitment to thousands of care-experienced children and adults to keep the promise. This included where children are safe in their families and feel loved, they must stay. And families must be given support together to nurture that love and overcome the difficulties which get in the way. Now, say right off the bat, before the media leap in here, this is not money to keep children who are at real serious risk of physical or sexual harm with families. This is the way to mitigate some of the socio and economic difficulties that some families face that drive them into crisis. things that are being created by the activities of the UK government we've been discussing so far this evening, that the Scottish government is constantly trying to mitigate. So I think there's nothing but positive applause should come for this initiative from the Scottish government. The question is, will it be enough?
Well, it's an area in which I have no expertise at all. It sounds tremendously well intentioned, and I agree entirely with your interpretation of the situation. You did suggest that there may be some difficulties in terms of the media representation of this, and you can be sure that the tabloids and no doubt BBC Scotland as well will find individual cases where it's gone wrong, where someone has been left in a family and they've been hurt, and they will use that to somehow try and condemn the whole process. It's a sad state of affairs, but that's a repeat occurrence now in our media. Is to find one case and try in an attempt to undermine any Scottish Government initiative.
I sometimes wonder just what we could do with all the money that the Scottish Government isn't having to spend in order to mitigate the policies of the UK Government. I mean, child poverty is up front and central in this initiative, and yet we know that some of the poorest families are going to be nearly £1,300 a year worse off, and that is an absolute tragedy. If there's been a theme for tonight, John, I think it's been this vast difference between approach to the people of Scotland by the current Scottish Government against what we're seeing in England, which is cynical, which is uncaring, lacks compassion, and isn't prepared to listen at all. Is that a fair summing up, do you think, of where we stand between the two countries at the moment?
It is. You've only got to look at the people who lead the governments. I mean, just a short time ago, I compared the situation where you have people who have gone to private school, they're boys really, I should say, largely boys who've gone to private schools and to Oxford or Cambridge, and we've done useless subjects like classics for their degree and are then contemptuous of more useful disciplines, and they make a mess of running a country, and contrast them with two women, comprehensively educated, who've come up through careers and in law and nursing and so on. I was thinking of Jane Freeman and Nicola Sturgeon, and they make a better job of running a country. Why is anyone surprised about that?
And so, do you think that this punitive action on people that is, that the UK government is driving, and the broken promises, do you think that makes independence more or less likely?
It should make it more likely, but sadly, I don't think it's a guarantee, because I think there is a deep-seated anxiety, which the media, I think, have been very successful in keeping going, with regard to change. If BBC and and the Herald and all the other pro union outlets, they don't have to attack the idea of Scottish independence on a general basis. What they have to do is keep reporting stories which people will come to associate with uncertainty and anxiety. So problems with waiting lists or with individual people who've not been treated well, and somehow making a connection, sometimes just with a photograph of Nicola Sturgeon in the corner, so that kind of wears away the kind of confidence. And people who are anxious and depressed don't vote for change. We know this from research across the Western world. People who are anxious and depressed, who watch the news a lot, will vote for continuity, even if the continuity is responsible for their suffering. That's a very sad note to end on.
Well, we'll try and end on something a bit more positive. I think when Margaret Thatcher was elected, I think it was her, and we had our famous Francis of Assisi's declaration on the steps of Downing Street.
Oh.
I think it was then that it might have been Michael Foot who had said, don't be poor in this country in the future. Don't be lacking in education in the future in this country, because this government will do nothing for you, and really nothing has changed. There's a lot of anxiety and uncertainty in the world. That the UK government's its own programme for government just now couldn't be more different than what we're looking at in Scotland. And we have to hope that anxiety and uncertainty that people in England in particular are going to suffer from is going to make a kind of change, and people up here will see that there is a different way, and their change might be coming. So on that note of a different way and change might be coming, thank you very much for joining me this evening. That's all we have time for tonight. I hope you've enjoyed the programme. We always end with a plea to help keep us going. If we've learned one thing tonight, particularly with John's interventions, is that we need an alternative and an independent broadcaster that is going to look at the stories in a different way and isn't always going to look for the bad in everything in Scotland. And that's what Broadcasting Scotland does. So please go online, have a look at the website. It's on the screen just now, and make a commitment to support Broadcasting Scotland in the future and help us keep going so that we can help be part of that change. Thank you and good evening. Thank you, John.